when you're feeling the emotions, hindi agad nakaka-catch up yung brain mo sa nafe-feel. And one of the
Yeah.
ways on how you can sync them is through breathwork.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that?
Our brain kasi is wired or designed for survival. It's not really wired for happiness. And so that's why we really have to train the mind. So once we perceive something, it always registers in the emotional part of our brains first. And then, not long after, it gets to the prefrontal cortex. So this is why we can have experiences where we would snap at people. You know, on a fit of rage, we would say something, and then shortly after, we would think, oh, I should not have said that. Once we get to that point of like regret or realization, that's only when the prefrontal cortex was able to catch up from that emotional response. And so that's why the breath is so powerful, because it gives our logical, our thinking mind, or our prefrontal cortex time to catch up to the emotional center of the brain.
Balikan ko lang, Coach, yung sinabi mo kanina, difference ng emotions sa kanong feeling. So how would you label yung emotions at saka yung feeling, and how would it help you regulate your emotions if you know how to differentiate the two?
Right. So again, like feeling is just
Mental health ka dyan.
Siguro I want to start, Coach, with emotional regulation. How does emotions affect mental health? But first, I want to share muna how you were able to help me with this when I worked with you as my coach. Sobrang nakita ng friends ko yung change sa akin. But syempre, alam mo, may mga times na you're just a human being. Nag-relax ka din. Ayun. So
right.
First, I want to know how emotions are connected to mental health.
Right, sure. So emotions, I really like it kapag na we're doing podcasts like this, things like that. And as a coach, really, and I'm not sure if we have done it in one of our sessions, is one of the things that we do is we really get clear on how we define terms, right? And so let's start off by defining what an emotion is. Kasi a lot of people interchangeably use emotion with feeling, but there is a difference. Feeling is a physical sensation, right? When we feel something, there's something in the body that accompanies the feeling. Now, emotion is similar but different in that emotion is just feeling with a story. So, for example, if we feel tightness in our chest, or we feel a lump in our throat, or we feel there's low energy in our body, and then we add a narrative or a story about those sensations, then it becomes an emotion. Now, emotions play a really crucial role when it comes to mental health, right? Because how we deal with emotions that we experience on the moment-to-moment basis affects how we interact with the world and with other people. So emotional regulation, very important. When it comes to regulation, it's like you cannot do emotional regulation if you don't have emotional awareness. So that is the first step to emotional regulation, is first developing that awareness, being able to feel your feelings, right? Creating that psychological distance from the feeling and the story that we make about the feeling. Because sometimes we just feel something and then we create a narrative around the sensation, and then we create some sort of like unnecessary suffering about the sensation. And so we suffer unnecessarily. So we want to be, in a way, objective observers of the feelings. Like if we feel something, how can we feel it so that we just, in a way, just look at the feeling or just sit with the feelings and just observe it. And, through that emotional awareness, we can notice how an emotion behaves. When we feel something and when we observe it, similar to our thoughts, we see the nature of emotions, and we can see if we're really attuned and if we've really developed that awareness muscles, that just like thoughts, emotions come and go. They have an impermanent nature. Here's the thing, kasi people struggle with emotional regulation because, of course, if you're not developed in that area, and we really cannot, blame people when it comes to how emotionally unintelligent people are, because that's just something that's not taught, in the educational system. Our parents also don't know about well, majority of, the parents don't really know about emotional regulation. It's sort of like a skill that we have to learn in adulthood, really take the responsibility of learning the skill. Because again, it's not taught. So we can exercise compassion then, because now we understand that that's people just don't know how to emotionally regulate. So it is a privilege to be able to know about emotional regulation, to practice it, and then to be able to also demonstrate to people that you can regulate emotions, to show them that possibility. Yeah, so I think I'm kind of babbling here a little bit about emotional regulation, but I hope that that kind of like idea vomit is making sense.
Yes, definitely, coach.
Are you following? But yeah, so to make it short, in summary, emotional regulation, we need emotional awareness first in order to regulate. We can go also deep around the physiology around emotions,
Yes.
why we experience emotions, things like that. If people would like to learn more, like, how emotions evolved and why emotions are so deeply connected to our body. Kasi evolutionarily speaking, our peripheral nervous system, the physical sensations that we feel, the peripheral nerves, it developed with the emotional center of the brain.
Mm.
They kind of like develop together. That's why when we feel something, there's a body sensation. If we feel angry, the muscle is tense. We clench our fist. Our mouth is dry. We have no appetite. We're not in the mood
Mm.
for sex or procreation, things like that. If we feel sad, there's weakness in the body. Our posture is different. So there's this mind-body connection, right? So that's because biologically speaking, they're very connected. And so that's why it's really important also when it comes to emotional regulation to be able to learn to create intimacy with your own body. Because
Mm.
that's one way to snap out, especially out of difficult emotions. Kasi a lot of people try to think their way outside of certain feelings or emotions, especially if the emotion is difficult or uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Sometimes, for example, if we feel feelings of depression, our thought process is like, how do I not feel depressed or how do I feel happy? And there might be some value to that, but sometimes that keeps people psychologically locked because sometimes the solution is in the body. So dealing with those sensations, observing those sensations, letting those sensations resolve. In spirituality, we would use dissolve as a word. We kind of like just let it dissolve, let it parang run its course, and then it goes away permanently. So yeah. So I think one last refinement is that if we don't learn how to do this, the emotion is just there. It's stuck. So in spirituality, there's this term called samskara. It creates this block in our system.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah. So unless we
Got
dissolve those blocks, they're just there. We never really healed those. We can look away and avoid feeling those feelings, but when when the original trigger is there, it just gets re-triggered, and so we're never really healed. It just gets triggered again. So it's like there's a momentary we don't feel the emotions, but then once the trigger is there, it's back again. Sometimes it's even more intense. It gets more intense if we don't deal with them when we experience them, if we're not able to process them as they come.
Okay. So, yung blockage is that what you kumbaga caused siya by unprocessed emotions? Is that right, coach?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
There's even fields in like the healing arts, or even coaching. There's like somatic coaching or mind-body coaching, where for a lot of people, if people who are in chronic pain, and I'm not saying this is the absolute cause, but sometimes unprocessed emotions creates pain in the body. It creates back pain, it creates, tight shoulders, things like that. And the solution is not always, chiropractics, although in some cases that's the solution. In some cases, it's the mental emotional work. It's doing coaching,
Yes.
journaling, expressing, venting, things like that. And then, like we said, processing the emotion. So unless the original cause, the root cause of the tension is not resolved in the mind, the pain continues. And that's why some people struggle with pain chronically. So any emotions that we don't deal with, it creates those tensions psychologically and physically. So there's a tightness
Connected.
psychologically and physically. So the muscles are tight, we're clenched, our system is closed, we're not open. So that tends to happen if we're not able to process those emotions.
Okay. Balikan ko lang, Coach, yung sinabi mo kanina, difference ng emotions sa kanong feeling. Kasi naalala ko, parang diniscuss mo sa akin yan dati, pero nakalimutan ko na. So, how would you label yung emotions at saka yung feeling? And how would it help you regulate your emotions if you know how to differentiate the two?
So again, like feeling is just body sensation. So if you feel something, it's in the body. It's always in the body. It becomes an emotion when we go to the mind. That's why one thing we do when we're doing when we're processing emotions is to instruct clients to stay out of the mind and stay in the body. So I think I'm not sure if we've done this because we've worked so it's been so long since we've probably tried that process, but it's like staying out of the narrative, staying out of the story, and just sitting with the feeling. So it's about finding the most intense part of the most intense part. So, for example, sometimes in healing work or in shadow work, we do a process called tuning where we help the client get into the mental emotional state of whatever it is they want to try to heal or process. And so we get them into the mental space of like, okay, what's stressing you out? What's your mental emotional block? And then once they're feeling that, through their imagination, through guided visualization. Like, for example, they have stage fright or they have relationship problems. So we let them imagine those situations so that they are in the mental emotional signature of that situation or circumstance. And the reason why it works is because the mind cannot differentiate between imagination and reality. So when we're doing these coaching sessions, it's like the client is in that situation, although it's just imagined, right? It's not real, but it feels real. And so what's nice when we do that in coaching is like there's a safe space to process the emotion. They're not actually on stage speaking to a lot of people, or they're not actually with their partner who they're having relationship problems with. They're just, it's just me and the client. So once they bring themselves to that mental emotional state, we simply guide the client to their feelings, to go to their body. And usually something comes up.
Mm.
Sometimes it's a tightness in your chest. Sometimes it's a sinking feeling in your gut, in your solar plexus. Sometimes it's a heaviness on your shoulders. Sometimes it's a lump on your throat. Sometimes it's a tension anywhere in the body. And then once we were able to identify those tense parts, which in a way are the physical blocks of those mental emotional blocks, we just sit with the feelings. So we just guide the client to like, okay, observe the tension on your chest and stay with that tension and notice what happens. And sometimes, for more spiritual people, people who are into like esoteric woo stuff, we can provide instructions to send love to that area or to imagine that you're directing light towards that tense part. But generally speaking, you just observe it. That's how you really heal. And that's a very courageous thing to do because a lot of people, find that really hard to face their feelings, to feel their feelings. And so they remain mentally, emotionally stuck. And you know this because people are stuck because they self-sabotage. So once, yeah, so that's the number one sign that someone is mentally, emotionally stuck is their self-sabotage. Like they reach a certain ceiling, and once they reach that ceiling, whether that's personal or professional, they sabotage in order to return to that comfort zone. That's why this is really important work.
Okay. So, going back ulit dun sa feeling and emotions. Kasi you mentioned kanina, yung emotions is feeling with a story. Tama ba,
Mm-mm,
Coach? Okay.
right.
So, I think this is one of the things that talagang natutunan ko dun sa session natin is yung controlling the narrative, especially if it's not fact naman. So, and I believe that if you continue the narrative and you're not aware of it, makaka-affect talaga siya on how you decide, ganyan, how you react mentally. Can you walk us through the process of starting the feeling and then eventually pupunta siya sa mind mo, then magka-create ka ng narrative and then you would react na negatively ganyan. So how can you stop that? So you can also regulate yourself.
So I think the language is very important here because as humans, we will feel emotions. We can never remove emotions. We can never remove feeling things. We cannot numb ourselves to certain emotions. And the thing is, when we do try to numb certain emotions, we end up numbing all emotions. And this is why avoidance is very dangerous. For example, if we feel depressed, we start drinking in order to numb ourselves from that feeling. But in our numbing of the negative or uncomfortable emotions, we're also numbing ourselves from the joy and from all the good feelings and or emotions, right? So I also want to differentiate between emotional regulation and then investigating beliefs. Kasi beliefs is kind of like more like thought centric. It's more about like the mindset and thought systems, etc. And feelings is more like body work, like being in your body and things like that. Although there is some overlap. So like you said, when it comes to emotional regulation, when we do catch ourselves making a story about a sensation, right? We create assumptions or we jump to conclusions, and this is why emotional awareness is really important, because if we're not aware that we're making those assumptions, that we're making that narrative or that story that, like you said, may not be accurate, we're not going to be able to deal with those emotional experience. So one thing that we can do is we can do questioning as well. Questioning is very powerful to help us get unstuck. So, for example, if we feel a negative feeling and we make a story about it, and it graduates into an emotion, we can ask simple questions. We can challenge the incorrect narrative. And like you said, like asking questions like, is this absolutely true? Okay. And if your answer is like, yeah, or something like that, or if your ego mind or if your subconscious has convinced you that it is true, approaching the process with curiosity. And so asking other questions like, is the opposite of this true if not possible, or possible if not true? So just exploring the possibilities, exploring your options, just to open your mind. And this is the power of options, is because it opens us up psychologically. Because if we don't give ourselves options, we're sort of like, we get stuck because we get tunnel visioned. We only see one way out. We don't realize that there are many different paths to the same peak, which is just healing, or enlightenment, or like peace or joy. So it just opens us up psychologically.
So one of the things that you can do is questioning. Coach, parang
Mm-hmm.
when you're already creating a narrative in your head, question mo if totoo ba siya or hindi. Are there
Mm-hmm.
any other tools that pwede mong i-recommend for you to be able to like kumaga ground yourself and
Mm-hmm.
ayun, stop continuing the narrative na hindi naman totoo?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most important tools is to externalize. Externalizing means just getting the narrative or the negative thought or the rumination out of your head. So how do you externalize? You journal, you write about it. You just do a free flow writing. You free write. Don't, it's not performative writing. You're not writing to publish. No one's going to see your writing. Just write it on paper. Let your thoughts flow onto the paper. And something interesting really happens when we do this. When we're doing it, it creates an immediate relief because we're offloading the brain, and we're putting all the thoughts, all the negativity out of our head, onto the paper. This is really powerful. And so when talking about externalization, one other thing we can do is to express it. You can find someone you trust, a confidant, a coach, or a mentor, or your best friend, or your partner, and make sure that they really are ready to receive. They're open to receive, because not everyone is willing to be emotionally dumped on. For some people, when we vent on them, they might not take it well. That it might actually overwhelm them, or it might trigger their own problems, or they might, if they're not great listeners, they might also like try to match your frequency, and so you're just building up on each other's emotional experience. So it's important to also find your person when it comes to
Yeah.
these emotional problems that we may encounter. So that's one thing, externalization, either by writing it down, venting. And when I say venting, I also want to remove the negative connotations here, because when we say venting, it's like we're thinking that we're complaining and things like that. Sometimes if we use venting for the purpose of just like letting it out, it's good. As long as we're careful who we vent to, we're picky about who we vent to. So that's really helpful. If you want, you can also record, just say it. Any means of expressing can really help, bring those internal problems so we can externalize them. And the great thing about externalizing it is we sort of like create a physical representation of the problem. When we're journaling about it, we see the emotions on the page, we see the problem on the page or on the paper. It's much easier to deal with when we see the problem. One other thing that will really help with emotional regulation is mindfulness and meditation. We talked about, emotional awareness earlier, and that sort of just correlates with self-awareness or improving our consciousness or our presence. And so when we have difficult emotions, just being able to, like I said earlier, just sit with the emotions, not necessarily wanting to change it. And you mentioned a keyword earlier, is like you ask about how do we stop it. When it comes to mindfulness and or meditation, there's no goal necessarily to stop it. It's just observing. So it's just observing and then realizing through that experience that through the observation it actually stops. The thing sometimes is if we're adamant on stopping something, it kind of like creates a resistance because we're kind of like forcing it to end or to go away. So the approach here is different. It's just allowing. It's letting it be. And then through that allowing, through that letting it be, it dissolves, and we get to peace. So I think those are the two that I can think of. And one more thing is we talked about emotions, right? And the mind body connection. So one of the things that we can do is to change the body. There's this thing called neurohacking. And I want to operationally define this as just creating changes in the body creates changes in the mind and vice versa. So what does this mean? You do physical activity. So you exercise, you do yoga, you change your posture, you improve your posture, you take a walk. If you've been sitting for so long and you feel stuck, stand up. If you're standing up and you feel whatever, sit down, whatever. Anything, any change in the body changes the mind. So any physical movement, dance, do yoga, do tai chi, do qigong or qigong, anything really that you like. And this is sort of like treat this as an experimentation process, as a discovery process. If you're new to doing mental emotional work and trying to raise your emotional intelligence, try different things and take note of what modalities, what techniques specifically works for you. Like for example, for me, I love doing yoga. I love going out for a run. In fact, I went out I was out running before this call. And so do what works for you. I don't like going to the gym. I'm not really I'm not really into weightlifting. I like calisthenics, things like that. So those are my go-to ways for doing that neurohacking, changing my body so I can change my mind. And that really works. That really works. It's super effective.
Okay. So, one of the things I remember pala, okay, I remember during our session that I think really helped me when you explained to me when you're feeling the emotions, parang hindi agad nakaka-catch up yung brain mo sa nafe-feel mo. And one of the
Yeah.
ways on how you can, kumbaga parang, how you can sync them is through breathwork.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, exactly. So here's the thing. Because how the brain is wired, earlier we talked about how the emotional centers of the brain developed with the peripheral nervous system. Also, in terms of like evolution, the emotional center part of our brain developed first. Our brain developed in layers kasi. So we have this reptilian brain. This is the part of our brain that we share with every other animal, and then there's a mammalian brain, and then there's the neocortex, the new brain, the prefrontal cortex. This is the biggest part of our brain, but it's still very young. in terms of evolution. So why do I mention this? I mention this because the emotional brain developed first, over millions of years, it has a very strong influence in how we run things and how it sort of like runs our lives, right? I think there's a popular saying in marketing or sales that we buy with emotion and then we rationalize the purchase after, right? Also, when it comes to sensory input, why do we feel feelings or emotions? It's because there is a cue or a trigger, and usually it's something that we perceive through our senses. We hear something, we see something, or we smell something, and that triggers an emotion, right? So through those senses, whatever we can physically sense in our environment, they go through a part of the brain called the thalamus. So the thing is, this part of the brain has very short connections to the emotional centers, but the connection is not thick. And it's also connected to the prefrontal cortex, the rational part, the logical part of the brain. But the connection is longer, but it's denser. So the implication of this is like when we perceive something through our senses, it arrives at the emotional centers first. Because again, the connection is short. But because the connection is not thick, it tends to register in incomplete information. Now, this is important if what we perceive is dangerous, right? If there's a car running fast towards us, we don't have to analyze the color of the car, the brand of the car, the plate number. We just get out of the way because, to save ourselves from the trouble. And so, for that reason, there is value to that. But our brain kasi is wired or designed for survival. It's not really wired for happiness. And so that's why we really have to, train the mind. So here's the thing. So once we perceive something, it always registers in the emotional part of our brains first. And then not long after, it gets to the prefrontal cortex. So this is why we can have experiences where we would snap at people, like they say something bad and we, on a fit of rage, we would say something. And then shortly after, we would think, oh, I should not have said that. Oh, I regret saying that. Once we get to that point of like regret or realization, that's only when the prefrontal cortex was able to catch up from that emotional response. And so that's why the breath is so powerful because it gives our logical, our thinking mind, or our prefrontal cortex time to catch up to the emotional center of the brain. And sometimes, in most cases, it really just takes one breath. Okay, three breaths max, but one breath is all it takes for us to be able to like not be reactive, to deal with emotional experiences in a more mature way. So yeah, that's the explanation why. It's a really lengthy explanation, but I hope it demonstrates why it works. There is neuroscience behind this, there's research behind this, so that's why it works.
Thank you, Coach. Okay, so regarding kanina naman dun sa yun nga, unprocessed emotions, no? Babalik ako dun sa unprocessed emotions that could cause self-sabotage and eventually can affect you mentally. So, can you tell me more about paano nagkakaroon ng blockage and also how can you refrain yourself from self-sabotage, ganyan. Later on, I'm also going to go back sa numbing, dun sa avoidance. Pero I want to focus muna dun sa self-sabotage.
Yeah, so every time we feel an emotion, sometimes because the thing is we're picky with emotions. We label emotions kasi there's good emotions, there's bad emotions, there's positive emotions, there's negative emotions. And sometimes this labeling may not be helpful because it creates a mindset that some emotions are bad or not good. But if you really think about it from a higher level, all emotions are just neutral. And I like to always say that emotion is just information. If you feel something, it's just your body's just telling you something. And that's why to add to that repertoire that we talked about earlier in how to deal with emotions, you approach it with curiosity. You can also ask questions like, what is this emotion trying to tell me? If you feel down, if you feel bad, like going into your body and just making that inquiry, that self-inquiry or reflection. What is this emotion trying to tell me? So now the emotion is actually useful, even if previously we thought that the emotion was bad, right? But now it's sort of like a source of wisdom or inspiration or intuition. So when we don't feel our emotions, they kind of like just get lodged in our system, because all emotions or feelings really want to do is just to pass by. And if we're not letting them pass by, they stay there. That's what creates a blockage in our system. And it just stays there unless they're processed, unless they're dissolved, or unless they're allowed to pass. So that's why those blockages exist. And sometimes we can feel that, you know, of course, naturally the emotion will go away. But if we have not dealt with the emotion then and there, we only have an illusion that it's not there anymore, but it's still there. So the emotional wound is still there. Just like physical wounds, emotional wounds or negative experiences that we might have, negative emotional experiences, just like the physical wound, they also need attention and care. And when we don't give it the attention and care that they want, they kind of like throw a tantrum and they come back with a vengeance. And that's why self-sabotage happens. It's like, why you're not why you're not paying attention to me? So our emotion sometimes just wants our attention. And what we can do and how we can process those emotions is to give them that attention.
So, with self-sabotage, coach, can you give me an example of how people usually self-sabotage without them being aware that it's already a sabotage, ganun? And paano nila makakatch yung self nila if they're already in that position? Kasi parang ang hirap if you're not aware of your emotions. I think mahirap din maging aware if nag-self-sabotage ka na. So, how do you get to the point of that kind of
Right.
awareness?
So sometimes kasi a lot of people resist facing their feelings or their emotions because these feelings or emotions are difficult or uncomfortable. So they sort of like look away, they brush it to the side, etc. So like you said, unless we have emotional awareness, we can never heal from these emotions because awareness is the first step to transformation. And so it is unfortunate that for some people, sometimes rock bottom is necessary to jolt them into awareness. Sometimes you self sabotage to a point where you've lost everything, you're bankrupt, you've ruined all your relationships, you've lost all your clients for you to realize that the root cause was your inability to deal with the emotional causes of the sabotage. Now, this is not always the case, but it is often the case for some people because for people who don't have the emotional awareness, like you said, they don't know. So the emotions are in the dark. So we think about awareness as like a light, right? So as long as those emotional wounds, those psychological wounds are in the dark, we can't really solve them. And so we need the light of self-awareness or of presence in order to heal them. And so, like you said, sometimes we can go through life sabotage after sabotage without really knowing that we are sabotaging. And like I said, it is unfortunate that sometimes it has people get to rock bottom, like they get addicted to something, like drugs or alcoholism, and they ruin everything, and they have until they're rock bottom, and there's no other way but sometimes that is the case, and it is an unfortunate aspect of the human nature. But yeah, and so we really have to be grateful if we have some level of emotional awareness, if we're able to recognize these internal experiences and be able to deal with them accordingly. For some people, they may be emotionally aware, but they don't know how to process, right? They feel anger and they don't know how to deal with it. They feel sadness or depression or anxiety, not in a clinical sense, but in terms of like the emotionality of it. They're not able to deal with it. And so it kind of like wreaks havoc in their life. So, for a good example of self sabotage is like alcoholism. Occasional drinking is fine. I'm not trying to villainize alcohol here, but the root of all addiction is avoidance. So, if we have,
Oh,
let's say,
avoidance.
yeah, that's a really good one.
Oh.
So, so addiction in all sense of the word, whether it's like sexual addiction, porn addiction, substance addiction, all addictions. The root is avoidance. So, for example, if you feel negative feelings and you don't have the problem solving repertoire to deal with that depressed feeling, a lot of people tend to, drink alcohol, and the goal is to numb the feeling. So when you numb the sadness or the loneliness or sometimes even the grief, it's only a band-aid solution. It's only treating the symptom, not the cause. The cause is the emotion. So we're just dealing the symptom. And so temporarily, the feelings of sadness or depression goes away. But then the next day we have the hangover, and then later in the day we feel the depression again because we didn't deal with the original cause in the first place. And so we think that drinking again will help solve the problem, so we drink again. So it's like a cyclical thing that happens. The emotion goes away, but not really. It's just a temporary going away. It's an illusion of resolution. But then the next day it's back again, or maybe next week, 2 weeks from now, it's back again. And so we go back to that same solution that we thought works, which is, drinking alcohol. But then the thing is, we develop tolerance, and so we have to increase, our dosage of the alcohol. We drink more and more and more until it creates a dependence, a substance dependence, and eventually it becomes an addiction. And sometimes you get to a point in your life where you're self-sabotaging, and you get to rock bottom, and without self-awareness, you get to a point of like, how did I get here?
Mm.
How did I get here? Everything was like a blur, and all of a sudden, your life's ruined. So that's why emotional awareness is really important, and doing the inner work of dealing with the emotions when we experience them, not brushing them, off to the side, not avoiding them, and not necessarily trying to stop them, just giving them space, giving them a spotlight in our psyche, in our mind, just so they can pass and they can be processed and they don't betray us later in
Mhm.
our lives.
Okay. So, how would you discuss about if you were able to process your emotions? How is that different from a person? Like, for example, if we have comparison, like a person A, person B, a
Mhm.
person who knows how to process her emotions versus yung hindi marunong mag-process ng emotions, how would that affect them in their decision making?
Yeah, I think one common distinction is sort of like a locus of control. I think people who are more emotionally aware and are able to emotionally regulate take responsibility of their emotional experience and their life. And so their mindset is, I'm responsible for these feelings. When someone triggers them in the context of their relationships, they have this mindset of like, okay, I'm triggered. It's me who's triggered. It's I take responsibility for this trigger. It means that I have a wound in this area. A wound was brought to the surface. Compared to someone who is not emotionally aware or does not know how to emotionally regulate, they tend to blame others. They tend to not take responsibility for their emotional experiences. For example, if someone triggers them in their personal relationships, their romantic relationships, or even in their professional relationships, it's always a they problem or a you problem. They never looking inside. They're always looking outside, and they always think that they're a victim to their circumstance. And so they also have this belief that the world should adjust to them, accommodate them. So in a way, their world should be organized in a way so that they're not triggered. But then that's not how reality works. So I think that's one distinction. And also, people who are emotionally intelligent, tend to be more resilient. They naturally have optimism. They naturally have a growth mindset. When they are faced with problems or challenges, their thinking is, okay, what's the solution here? How can I deal with this? Or if they want to be reflective, how did I contribute to this problem and how can I stop it from happening again? Versus people who are not so emotionally intelligent, they think, okay, who can I blame here? Who is responsible? Whose fault is this? And they are transfixed on the problem. And when that happens, they're not open to the solution. And so they stay psychologically stuck. And that's what tends to happen. And I think a really important thing, sorry, not thing, a really important example when it comes to emotional awareness and regulation is in the context of relationships. When we have relationships with people, People will trigger us. They'll reveal our wounds to us. Not always, but occasionally they'll say something or they'll do something that triggers us. When we don't deal with those triggers, the wounds stay open and stay stuck. And sometimes, if we don't take that responsibility and we blame the person, like it's your fault for triggering me or for causing these wounds, and you end the relationship, then you're simply just moving on to the next relationship with the same wounds. And so that's why some people can go from relationship to relationship to relationship and wonder, why do I keep attracting these kinds of people? Why do my relationships always end this way? And the reason why is because the original cause, which is the emotional issue or difficulty, was not dealt with in the first place. And so the problem is the same, it's just presenting itself in a different form, in the form of a different person or a different relationship. And so that's why this work is really important, because unless we do that healing, you know, the problem will just perpetuate in a different, circumstance, in a different setting, in a different environment. It's the same problem unless we deal with it, unless we process, unless we heal.
It's interesting, Coach, that you mentioned about relationships. And I always see online nga, like, yung relationship is like a mirror of kung ano yung wounds mo. Ganun.
Yeah,
So, can you tell me more about the dynamics of that? Like, paano nangyayari yung nagiging mirror yung partner mo for you to see yung mga kailangan mong i-address?
right. So I think like we can look at this in the perspective of like spirituality, right? There's this concept of like cosmic oneness or unity. Like we're all just one. And we even know about the golden rule across all of the traditional, across all traditions in great religions. What I do to others, I do to myself. What I withhold from others, I withhold from myself. So there's this idea or concept of oneness, right? Also, perhaps we can borrow from psychology that perception precedes reality. And so when it comes to the people that we deal with in our personal or professional lives, a lot of the stuff that we see on other people, we filter for based on our own personal biases and our own past experiences and our own set of beliefs and mindset. And so that sort of like creates this expectation. Often people behave a certain way because we expect them to behave that way, if that makes sense. When we are engaged in relationship, right, the purpose of relationships is, and I like to always borrow from spirituality that all relationships are holy relationships. So in a way, the relationships that we encounter in our lives, whether that's personal or professional, the relationship is meant to contribute to our growth, to our enlightenment, as you put it in spirituality. And so it's really important to, again, have that curious mindset within the context of a relationship, asking, what is this person trying to teach me? Having that kind of like mindset. And when you talk about mirror, that term mirror, I think you're just referring to like projection. Like a lot of the things that we experience in our lives and in the world is just a projection. And so that's why we need that self-awareness so that we're aware, what are my perceptual filters? What is the lens with which I look at the world, right? Because we tend to look at the world through our past experiences, through our past traumas, through our own cognitive biases as well. And so when we do not heal ourselves or when we do not identify and challenge or change any limiting beliefs, we will continue to look to the world or to address your question at other people through those lenses. And so more often than not, there's a really let me just segue real quick. There's a really powerful exercise that we do is that we think about like people we admire the most and we think about the qualities that they have, and then we also think about the people that we hate, that we don't like, and we also think about the qualities that we hate or don't like about them, and then we reflect on those qualities that are good and those qualities that we like and don't like. And then this is actually an exercise in projection in that those qualities that we like are qualities that we like about ourselves. And those qualities that we hate or dislike in other people are actually also qualities of ourselves that is hidden in the shadows. It's sort of like our
Mm.
blind spots, our blind spots. So that's an exercise in projection. So I hope that answers your question in terms of like
Yes.
people are just mirrors. in that they just reveal to us what we already know in a way. They just reveal back to us who we are or who we think we are. And I think that's why relationships are really important. Because again, they help us see ourselves, they help us reflect. And through that reflection, there's awareness. And through that awareness, like I said earlier, there's transformation. You cannot transform without awareness. Awareness is the first step.
Yes. And ang ganda ng sinabi mo kanina, coach, na parang when you don't notice kung ano yung issues mo, parang you just bring it the next relationship and it will resurface but in a different form, but it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's when you're in a relationship, it's also important that you are in a relationship, not because you're only in a relationship, but also it's an opportunity for you to grow and to see
Yeah.
ano yung mga triggers mo that you can address, ano yung mga
Mm-hmm.
unprocessed emotions mo na hindi na-address. So, and if that's the case, possible yun na pareho mag-work ang relationship, no? If you're both willing to do the work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And it may also be possible that through doing that work, some people may feel like they outgrow the partner.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes the natural conclusion of the relationship is that the relationship ends. And this is not necessarily bad, you know, as long as you learn from that relationship and as long as you honor the purpose that that relationship has served in terms of your spiritual growth, your mental, emotional growth, and you can end terms amicably, and you know it's not really a loss on anyone's part. But yeah, my point is that that tends, not necessarily that tends, but that can happen. A relationship can end even if both parties have healed, because sometimes like it's their traumas that got them together. And then once they've healed, they've realized, oh, okay, it's actually we're not a match. We have different priorities, values, etc.
Yun. So I think that's all the questions that I have. Thank you so much, Coach. And yeah, for those who are listening who would like to work with Coach Chris, and when it comes to emotional regulation and also when it comes to your mental health, you can find him sa Facebook, Chris Acebu, right? And you have
Yeah.
a website as well.
Yes. So
Okay.
it's just chrisacebu.com.
Anything else, Coach? Anything else that you'd like to invite them? Do you have a course? Yan. Anything?
Yeah,
Anything?
so right now, just one-on-one coaching, but I am working on recorded guided meditations, and I'm also doing some recorded hypnosis probably later in the year,
Mm.
because that's one way that we can help clients too with mental emotional problems, is like dealing with it on a subconscious level. And the subconscious mind is closely linked to the emotional mind. And so for people who find it really hard to make these changes, hypnosis is one way to make that change effortlessly or less hard, because you just listen to the audio. So I think those are in my roadmap, professionally. But otherwise, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about coaching. If you would like to inquire, if you want to do a quick like discovery call or a free session, that would be great. And just send me a DM or just go to chrisacebu.com/coaching and you can book a time with me.
Thank you so much, Coach.
Mental health ka dyan.